Welcome, everyone, to the third part in our series, Seeing the Sacred in Nature. And today we're very happy to welcome Pastor Bruce Benson, now retired from being a pastor at St. Olaf for 30 years. And then also the director of Ode to Joy, and a great friend and advocate of trees. And it's for that reason that he is here today to talk about, is it okay to love a tree? Welcome. Oh, you have your own. That's
I'm going to begin in a totally unplanned and unprepared way because of this Sunday's sermon. And I'm going to do this because I'm feeling overwhelmed by the enormity of the planet's problems, its problems in nature, and by the enormity of the suffering that what we've done to nature is doing to human beings, and by the lack of time there is to do anything serious about all of this. I'm also feeling a little out of place. I should be in the woods instead of standing here talking about the woods, but let that go. So I am going to propose a way of Christians thinking about this, but just in case, 2 ways is better than one. Anton knows that I do not like the Transfiguration story. I do not like Transfiguration Sunday. I hate preaching on Transfiguration Sunday, and the reason he knows that is he once volunteered me to do it in Australia without my permission. And frankly, I only remember one Transfiguration story or one Transfiguration sermon that I preached. And you'll see in a minute why I'm going to remind you of it, or remind myself of it today. The reason I don't like Transfiguration Sunday is that I think almost all of us get so taken with the light, the bright light, that we don't pay any attention to what's being illumined by that light. It's all bright, shining light. Isn't it wonderful? And the story is really about the disciples' eyes being opened to who the heck this Jesus character is. That's what's happening there. And so it's a revelation in that sense. It's an aha moment for the disciples. I get it. So I was trying to figure out, how do I talk about that to students? And for better or worse, here's the example I came up with. The first summer that Carol and I worked at a Bible camp in Alexandria, Minnesota, she had one boyfriend and I had a different girlfriend. And they lasted for most of the summer, and that was about it. And then the second summer, the first week we were there, in my eyes, Carol was transfigured. All of a sudden, she was a different person than the summer before. And I don't think what I saw was fake and phony. What I saw is who she really is. So that's a transfiguration. So I'm bringing that up now because if we're going to get to some notion, some understanding, some belief in any kind of sacredness in nature, it might require a transfiguration. We have to let nature be transfigured for us so we see it as more than a word I'm going to criticize in a minute, more than just a resource for us to do with as we please. Okay, so if transfiguration works better for you than love, now you've got your transfiguration. Dramas don't tell you where something is going to go, but this is not a drama, so I'm going to give you an itinerary of where we're going. I think as Christians, we need to start with the things that are in our way, getting to a notion of the sacred in nature. And because those things are in our way, I'm going to propose that as Christians, we have an optional way of thinking about it rather than just thinking about the sacred in nature, that we can think about love. We're better at love than we are at seeing sacredness anywhere except in church, all right? And then I'm going to propose that if we're going to learn to love the natural world, for most of us, trees are a great place to start because I think we already half love trees anyway. So it's a baby step to get to loving them. But we better not romanticize. This is trees at work as well. Trees do this, and they do this. And if you think this only happens somewhere else, people in Wangs Woods, Northfield couldn't get home one day because this tree fell down on the road through Wangs Woods, just a quarter of a mile from here. So we will not romanticize, but we are going to head for the idea of loving trees. There are 4 impediments I want to mention, and the first one is probably for us the biggest one, and that is our particular religion. We have all, at least judging by your ages, I would guess that's true of all of us in this room, we have been warned against becoming too pantheistic, seeing too much sacredness in nature. We don't want to be like those druids and pagans and animists around the world. We've been cleansed of all of that nonsense, and we are Christians. Much of that probably starts with the verse from Genesis about what are we supposed to do with nature regarded as sacred? No, we're supposed to have dominion over it, and in fact, subdue it. Now, we can go many places to try to back off of some of the way we have interpreted all of that, and I hope we do. But the fact that we have interpreted subdue as subdue and dominion as dominion means that now it's an impediment for us to get to any sort of notion of nature as sacred. And the quote from Isaiah I just put in there, not every translation does it this way, but a very popular current translation, the New International Version, does say, "You will be ashamed because of the sacred oaks in which you have delighted." Obviously, sacred trees is a no-no. So how do we get past all of that? Even worse in our history is the notion that somehow nature on its own is a problem waiting to be solved, or at least an opportunity waiting to be seized. That is, that you know that the history of Christianity in the West saw wilderness as more of a threat than something to love. It's something to overcome, not something to love. My favorite story about this, I'm pretty sure I heard this joke from my grandfather. It's that old, that a preacher had noticed that one of the farmers in his congregation was pretty bad at church attendance and pretty bad at putting anything in the offering when he did come, and decided to pay a pastoral visit on this gentleman. So he went out to the farm, and he and the farmer walked around a little bit, and finally the pastor and the farmer stopped at a fence and looked out over the land, and the preacher, being clever like preachers always think they are, the preacher looked out and said, "You know, this is a really wonderful farm that you and the good Lord have together here." And the farmer spat out a little bit of tobacco and said, "Yep, but you should have seen what a mess it was when the good Lord had it alone." It's that view of nature is there for us to do something with that becomes a problem of our own religion. Science, while I'm going to very soon come to how it can help us, we need to understand it can be a problem for us too, because that whole notion of it's kind of a misreading of Darwin, but nevertheless we have it in us, the survival of the fittest. That whole idea of that's what's going out there in the wild world is a big survival of the fittest war. Doesn't sound very sacred. And science itself, I mean, you don't treat the sacred as if it's a specimen, but science has to treat things like specimens. That's what you do. That's how you study them. You make specimens out of them. So science is just being science when it does that. But our mindset takes on some of that as well, and we look out at the world around us, and there's a nice specimen of an oak, and there's a nice specimen of a spruce tree, and it gets in our way. I think our language is also an impediment. You've probably noticed that we do not, in Minnesota, have a department of creation care. We don't have a department of honoring the natural world. We have a department of natural resources. I've put a quote in there from Richard Powers, who, when he was researching his novel Overstory, himself fell in love with trees and forests. I think he's absolutely right. It's not just the people in this room, it's our culture that sees the non-human world as not really interesting, not really alive, not sacred in any way that human beings are, but resources. We have come to think of trees that way. Trees are a wonderful resource. We don't dislike them. They're a great resource, but they are a resource. And we tell each other our job as human beings is to love people, use things. Don't use people, love people, use things. But where does that leave the whole natural world? We know for sure they aren't people. Trees aren't people. So they must be things. So we'll love people, and trees, therefore, are there for our use. Is that all they are for? That's the question. Is that all they are for, is our use? If so, then resources is the right thing. And resources isn't a bad word. I mean, parents are a resource to their children. Teachers are a resource to their students. We're all resources to each other. But is that all we are? Our parents, nothing but resources for their kids. Our teachers, nothing but resources for their students. Our trees, nothing but resources for firewood, lumber, etc. And our lifestyle. This quotation is from, as you see, from an Atlantic magazine. It's an essay on the joy of a snow day. So even in our work-focused culture, we can feel so guilty about not being productive. Leisure tends to be productive, running errands, running to classes, events, running to get in a quick workout. And the article goes on to say she's arguing that's why we like a snow day, because we don't go to nature. Nature comes to us and says, here I am, and there's nothing you can do about it. But our lifestyle doesn't let us do that. We wait for nature to come to us. So we have these things, I think, in our way. My argument for today, at least, is that as Christians, let's try love instead of forcing our way to understanding nature as sacred. Let's try to love it instead, because we already understand its power, its goodness, the command to love. We already understand it as a gift. We want to love, actually. We're that kind of people. We want to do it. But is it okay if you love a tree? If trees, and nature by extension, are not mere resource, but also not human, can we come to regard them with gratitude as a resource and with love as neighbors? Non-human neighbors, yes, but that would be a step toward St. Francis. And I'm going to end with some St. Francis. Let me introduce you to one of my neighbors. Anybody know where this tree is? I didn't expect you to, but if somebody showed it to me, I wouldn't be sure either, because it just looks like, well, it looks like an oak to me. And it is an oak. It's, pardon? Not Valley Grove, nope. It is the oak of Lone Oak Nature Center, just down the road from here. It's not a lone oak anymore, because young oaks have grown up around it. I put the caption there with it, which is Khalil Gibran, actually, because I think if we stop to look at this oak tree, I walk by it several times a week with the dog, and I always slow down when I go under it. The trail goes right under it, because this tree does feel to me like a poem. It's got that kind of elegance, it's that kind of beauty. So it's enticing me to love it. I think trees can do that for us. I know this 6-year-old in this photo, And you might say, well, this is a photo of Lake Superior, isn't it? And the kid's looking at Lake Superior, not paying attention to the trees, right? Yes, in a sense. But if you pay attention to where the kid is and where thousands of other Minnesotans want to be when they look at the lake, it's with the companionship of trees. It feels good to stand under those trees while you're looking at Lake Superior. Of course, when you're doing it, you're not paying much attention to the trees consciously. You're paying attention to Lake Superior consciously, but unconsciously, it feels good, comforting, friendly to be with the trees while you're doing that. And what about this? Any of you have treehouse when you were a kid? Nobody? Really? Oh, okay, here, yeah, see, nobody wants to admit it. I had 3 tree houses in one tree, a big old maple, first level, little walls, no roof, walls, floor was at 8 feet, and the next one that had a shingled roof and screens and all of that was at 16 feet, and then we had what we called the crow's nest at 30 feet, all in the same tree. Tree houses can be rented, you know, for vacation. Why in the world do we like tree houses? Is it just because we can go up there and feel like we're above everybody else? Maybe, maybe not. Is it because of evolution? We were all primates that started living in the treetops, so evolution says go back there again? I don't know. I just know that there's something about trees that the human species finds attractive and comfortable, and therefore I think is a wonderful gateway, if you will, into learning to love the rest of nature too. Of course, it has beauty, and in Minnesota, this is the time of the year when we probably especially love trees. We'll love them while they do this, but then once the leaves fall on our lawn, then we love them a bit less. Or if they fall on the neighbor's lawn and the neighbor wants to blow them away while we're trying to eat dinner on the deck outside, then we don't like them quite so much. But on a day like the one in this picture, we are in fact happy to share the world, not with trees because they provide us lumber, but because we like being in the same world with them. These 2 birds see this tree probably differently than we would if it were in our lawn. It's a dead snag, it's ugly, it's an eyesore, but to these 2 eagles, it's a fishing spot. I could suggest to my next door neighbor at the lake that he cut this tree down because it's on his property, but this picture was taken from our dock. Why would I want to cut down a dead tree? Okay, a little quiz. Can you identify any of these? Anybody know any of them? Pardon? Very good. Most kids say birch because it's white, but it's not birch, it's aspen. Anybody know the others? The one in the middle is hackberry. Many hackberry trees aren't quite that rough, but they are all rough like that. And the one on the left is cherry, also rough, but very different. Trees, like people, have different kind of skin. They grow together in the same woods. We love them all equally. They're all good for something. And I put those up there not because I like bark, but because I think one of the ways to come into loving nature is stopping long enough to pay attention to those differences, to slow down your life enough so that you can notice that the bark of a hackberry is not the same as the bark of a cherry. The bark of an aspen is not the same as the bark of a birch. There's a whole world out there that we just call trees and think it's all the same thing. It's not. It's an amazing world out there. What about these? These are more difficult. What about the one on the right again? That's right. It's Minnesota state tree, the Norway pine or the red pine on the right. See the little reddish tinge there? It very well could be. The one on the left is not fair of me to put up there because lots of trees look like that. This one happens to be an oak, but lots of trees do look like that. The one in the middle, I've showed the tree in the background as a hint. This also is in the Lone Oak Nature Area. Several years ago, I was reading about white pines. That's what that one is in the middle. And the essay I was reading said that the branches of the white pine point up mostly, not down. They point up. And that when it rains, the water runs down the branches to the trunk and then runs down the trunk so that by the time it gets to the bottom, there's practically little rivers coming off the tree. And I read that and I thought, that's nuts. That doesn't really happen. This guy's making that up. So the next time we had a real rain without lightning, I put on my jacket and my umbrella and I ran down to Lone Oak Nature Center to see for myself. And I looked at this tree, and sure enough, right at my eye height, there are little whitewater rivers running down the side of the tree. All of that water from the branches collected and going right down to the roots of that tree. Anybody know what that grove of trees is? Cedar, white cedar. What about the buds on the left and the cones? Pardon? Tamarack, exactly. Knowledgeable crew here. Yes, yeah. The cedar grove, I've watched other people in cedar groves. I know what I do in a cedar grove, but I've watched other people as well. And people tend to do the same thing in a grove of trees like this as they do in Preacher's Grove, white pines, in Itasca Park, or to an even greater extent amongst the redwoods in California. You slow down nearly to a stop. You're going to move on eventually, of course, but the first thing you do when you enter is you slow down. Why is that? There's something about a grove of trees like that that makes you feel that it's wrong to be in a hurry. And when you're not in a hurry, love can start to be born. So I recommend cedar groves. The tamarack buds, again, if you're in a hurry, you will not see anything that small because those cones are the size of my thumbnail, no bigger than that. And you'll be right past them. Slowing down is, maybe that's what this should be about, slowing down for the trees. Slow, trees ahead, that should be the sign on the side of the road. Let's move to the old growth, because sometimes we think a tree is a tree is a tree. When it comes to forests, that is not necessarily the case. So this past fall, a bunch of scientists, over 100 of them, wrote a letter to the people meeting at the Glasgow leaders in Glasgow, Scotland, on forests and land use. Do you see the statistic in there? Primary forests, that is old growth forests, store approximately 30 to 50% more carbon than previously logged forests. In other words, the idea that the old growth, the big trees, are meant for us to cut down and turn into lumber, and then because the next forest that comes up is still going to be a forest, so who cares? A whole diverse population of life cares. And carbon sequestration cares. The old growth is just better at that. It's also better at speaking to the human soul or heart, if you will. As a Finnish reindeer herder says, you don't go to a young forest to feel revitalized, you long for an old one. The old forest, just there, now I am grounded. I feel more whole in the old forest. And scientifically, somebody does all this science, you know. Birds lay stronger, larger eggs in old forests. I didn't know that either. The middle statistic here is about forests. This is from the Minnesota Land Conservancy. If you were here for prairies last time, you see that 99% of Minnesota's prairie is gone. And 44 doesn't look too bad for the forests until you read, oh, wait a minute, only 2% of old growth trees remain. So when we're talking old growth, 98% of Minnesota's old growth trees have been cut down. They're gone. Is there any loss? Absolutely. There's a loss for the biodiversity of the planet. There's a loss for carbon sequestration, for the air we breathe. There's a loss for us, I think, spiritually as well. This picture is ugly, I guess you'd say. Bare trees, a dead tree in the foreground, dead stuff lying around. Nobody's bothered to clean this up. It's a mess. But pay attention here. A dead tree has more life than a living one. Nearly all the wood cells in a living tree are dead. So once the tree has finished sending water and minerals up and sugars down for a growing season, then the part of the tree that has been sending the xylem, sending the sugars down, it is part of the next part of dead wood. It's dead. In fact, the xylem itself is dead cells. They're just hollow tubes so that liquid can flow in them. So most of a tree is dead until it's dead. And then suddenly, with the bacteria, the fungi, the moss, the insects, it comes to life. So loving trees means loving them when they're dead and alive. Trees for the air and not just for the wood. I'm guessing that if you've been to state parks, to the woods at all, you have noticed that you tend to like breathing in the woods. It feels good to breathe when you're in the woods. The statement at the bottom is what I've told my kids off and on over the years when we're up north. I say, if I'm ever both blind and deaf, and by that you'd think, well, what am I going to do up north? I can't hear the waves on Lake Superior. I can't see anything beautiful. Why would I want to go? I've told them, oh, I just want to go and breathe this air. As long as I can do that, I want to be up there to do that. So I always thought that was just an idiosyncrasy of mine. Some people like the woods and some people don't like the woods, and I happen to like it, so I go. But here's what's actually going on in the woods. Between 21 and 25 medicinal biochemicals are found in the spruce. We have lots of spruce on our lot up north. They're concentrated at the growing tips of the tree, which is the part that indigenous people used for medicine and for tea. You can still make spruce tea out of it. The dispersing of those agents into the atmosphere releases antibiotic and antiseptic properties, the same chemicals that do the work when you use pine disinfectant in your home. The meristems, that is the acting growing tip of the spruce, is actually sterilizing the air we breathe. So it's not just that I like the smell. I always thought it was just the smell. I like the smell. But the trees are actually making the air better to breathe at the same time. I love them even more. Not only that, you know these leaves, right? Maple. The underside of the maple tree, of the maple leaf, the part that we almost never look at, the underside of the maple leaf and other trees as well, have tiny, tiny little hairs on them. And those hairs collect particulate matter from the air that you're otherwise breathing, and they keep it there till the rain falls, and then all of that particulate goes to the ground instead of into your lungs. So even in a maple forest, the air is better than it is outside the forest. Maple syrup, turns out, is just a bonus. Clean air is even better. This is an old proverb. If you want to catch a fish, plant a tree. The scientist who discovered that it was true was Japanese as well, lived on the island of Hokkaido. And another scientist who verified the science is from Canada. Both of them, unknown to each other, were curious about the same thing. Why is there so much more life where a river flows into the ocean than farther away? Is it just fresh water? Does the life really like that fresh water? It turns out the answer is more complicated than that. It turns out that the ocean itself doesn't have enough iron in it for phytoplankton to make protein and thus become the sort of the first floor of the food chain, the first chain and the first link in the food chain. Everything feeds on that. So it has to get it from somewhere. Where does it get it? The trees in the forest dig it out of the ground with their roots. It goes to their leaves. The leaves fall in the fall. They fall into the river. The river takes it all to the ocean, and life teems at the mouths of those rivers because they're getting from the trees inland what they need for the ocean to produce life. It turns out that about half of the oxygen around us that we breathe comes from trees, and the other half comes from the sea, from the photosynthesis of the sea. In other words, almost all of it, in some form or another, comes from the trees. But there's more that trees do. Life doesn't flourish without water, and the oceans can provide rain for about 400 miles inland. But then after that, the water's all gone, and something else has to create the vapor and the clouds and the rain. Who steps in? The trees step in. We have rain in Minnesota because we have trees in Minnesota. Deforestation doesn't just mean that the land isn't as pretty as it used to be. It also means that it's going to be drier, or upwind is going to be drier. The trees are helping every other bit of life flourish. A couple oddities for you. This spruce tree in Sweden, 9,550 years old. That particular trunk you're looking at might not be that, but the tree, the root system, shoots that have come off of it, the scientists have marveled over this thing and said, we need to test this baby and see what's going on here. So they've carbon dated the roots of the tree, and it's 9,500 years old. If that doesn't give you a sense of wonder, not much will. Or this one. That's an aspen grove in Utah. Genetically, it's all one tree. The aspen propagates with underground runners that send up shoots, and so it has spread. This one organism, genetically one organism, now covers 107 acres, and it's 47,000 different trees. An African giraffe's opinion of the acacia tree might be like that. She loves me not. It's tasty not. Because the acacia tree and the giraffe have an interesting relationship. Giraffes love acacia leaves, and you can see they're about the only thing that can reach them when they're like this. They love those leaves, but the leaves don't love the giraffes very much. So when a giraffe bites the acacia leaf, it's very tasty and delicious, and it wants more. But when the giraffe does that, the tree says, hang on here, I don't want to be eaten up by a giraffe. And so it sends tannins to its own leaves, which turn the taste bitter. And the giraffe says, yuck, I don't want this anymore. Not only does it do that, but those tannins that it sends to its leaves then become its own aerosols out in the air, and those aerosols go to the nearby acacia trees, and they say, uh-oh, here come the giraffes. Better close up shop here, send the tannins. And they do. They do that. Now, whether we can talk about it in the language I just used or not is a different story, but that's what's going on. The giraffes, of course, are no dumber than the trees are, and they say, you know what, we better start grazing upwind instead of downwind, because the trees go faster than we do on the downwind side, so we'll go upwind where the breeze hasn't taken the warning yet. And that's what they do. Now there's the whole matter of the World Wide Web, and what should we do about that? This is a complicated issue. The forest scientist Suzanne Simard has been around for a few decades, and her science has been known for a few decades, but she sort of hit the spotlight when she released a book called Finding the Mother Tree. Her work, it was not the first, her work was the first to take laboratory experiments out to the real world and discovered that trees were not solitary individuals, but they lived in communities. Well, communities are where there's communication going on, and there is some communication between trees. The most amazing and disturbing to the Canadian Forestry Department thing that she discovered is that clear cutting a forest and getting rid of all of the stuff that's going to, compete with the growth of the tree turns out to be the exact wrong thing to do, because to her surprise and the world's continuing surprise, the Douglas firs that they prized so much were not being hampered. Their growth was not being hampered by the birch trees that were growing among them. The birch and the Douglas fir were in fact exchanging sugars and minerals and water. That when one tree gets enough sunshine to photosynthesize and make sugar, and one nearby in the shade is not getting enough, there's sharing going on. Now, other scientists have said, is this really the case or not? So science being science is always going to follow up and say, we need to try this too. Is this going to work or not? So I think you'd say from a scientific point of view, the evidence is still wanting. It's there, but we want more. We want to see if this is true in other places. The thing that helps the trees communicate or enables them to communicate is fungus underground, long, thin threads of fungus that carry signals and sugars from one tree to the next. Her term mother tree comes from another experiment she did where it appears, she's done these things by letting a tree absorb radioactive isotopes, the kind you can trace, and say, where does this isotope go? And that's how she learned that isotopes that she put into young Douglas firs showed up later in the birch. And the different isotopes she put in the birch showed up later in the Douglas fir. And others have done that science. That is true. We don't know what exactly is going on, but that's going on. They know that much. Another experiment she did that led her to call her book The Mother Tree is that the big old growth, wonderful trees that stand grandly in the forest seem to recognize their own young, if you will, and prefer sharing their carbon resources with their own young. They don't limit it to their own young, but that's their preference. So her word for that is mother tree. Now, whether we should be using human terms for trees is a big, huge debate. I saw a hand here.
So just going further with that, I once heard that trees recognize what other trees aren't getting enough nutrients, and that they can then give the nutrients to the tree that isn't getting them.
Right. Yeah, I mean whether you start with the tree recognizing or the tree that needs it sending a signal, I need it, all of that still is to be uncovered. But yes, that sharing is going on. Scientists are rightly afraid of anthropomorphism. I don't want them to suddenly get into anthropomorphism. They're rightly nervous about that. But at some point with life, remember, trees are alive. Trees are life. At some point when it gets to life, you have to start saying, how does our language help us instead of hurt us? And if it helps us understand to use language that we otherwise might not, then we should use the language that helps us get the point. Mother tree might be an overstatement, or it might be a little on the romantic side, but it helps us get the point she's trying to make. At least that's the way it seems to me. So what language are we going to use when we talk about this phenomenon in trees? I don't know. Mother tree works for me because I get that sharing of resources. In fact, when they get so old that they're ready to die, what do? Trees. Do they do like this and say, this is mine and I'm not sharing? No, the old trees, when they're getting ready to die, start getting rid of their own carbon resources and sending it to the trees around. It's I think, an absolutely amazing phenomenon And it's happening unseen by us most of the time. Back to sacredness. Until recently, it was an axiom of most human societies to see God in everything. And it is harder to chop down a forest or strip mine a meadow if you believe God lives there. But can we as Christians get there? That's indigenous religion. How can we get to that point? I think love is the first step on the way. Anybody recognize this tree? Yeah. You heard the term he used? That's the term I learned too. Witch tree. Witch, not which, but witch. The witches. That's the term I learned too. The indigenous people that live along the North Shore prefer spirit tree, which is probably a fair designation. But for us European Western Christians, who are always cautioned against, don't like nature too much, you're going to start being a nature worshiper, you're going to start being a pantheist, you're not going to be a Christian anymore. Witch tree is the perfect caution. Be careful, this is a witch tree, stay away from this. But it's a recognition of some people that there's more than wood going on here. And how you want to talk about that, we always have to be deciding whether we use sacred or not. But look at this. This is BBC News using the title Sacred Trees. Do you recognize that little cluster of trees there at all or not? Again, I don't expect you to, but what about that funny round thing in the middle? That's a church. That is a church. And this is Ethiopia. Okay, so read this. Those are churches, folks. Those are Christian churches in Ethiopia that have made the decision that part of what they need to do in their deforested country is protect trees. Now we're getting close to the end here. This is just an ugly sign, right? I took this picture 2 weeks ago in San Diego. The St. Olaf Band had a half a day near San Diego Zoo. It was raining, so people didn't go much to the zoo, but other places. And the botanical garden was closed, and this is the sign around it. I took a picture of the sign because the last 3 words are the ones that I think can be helpful. Restoring the wonder. If sacredness is too much, if loving a tree is too much, start with wonder. Can you just wonder about trees? I'm glad the Botanical Garden wants to do that. Now, I said I was going to end with St. Francis. This is the so-called prayer of St. Francis. And I'm going to propose an addition to it. So there you see the prayer. And here's the addition that I think would be suitable for our time. O Divine Master, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love, and to be sustained as to sustain. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, it is in sustaining the earth that we are sustained, and it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. So, can Christians, rightfully as Christians, participate in loving the trees? I think absolutely yes. So let's talk about it.
Now it's on. There.
So, the conversation and the comment about how trees communicate with one another.
Yeah.
How about our prairies? Scientists study that sort of stuff, and do they communicate?
I don't know, frankly. I do not know. Maybe somebody else knows. I don't know. But it sure makes you wonder. Yeah.
In each of these sessions, we've come to understand that fungi are so important for the prairie, for the garden, in your own backyard garden, and now and certainly with trees, it's the same. There's a common theme of fungi communicating with within their species, in their environment. So,
If in fact we also are creation, which we claim to be as Christians, we did not make ourselves, we are creation, we share with the rest of creation, which means the degree to which we make the rest of creation just things instead of life is the degree to which we misunderstand nature. And the things that we think can't be happening might be, like the communication among plants. I've been trying to figure out that communication myself, whether it's in the prairie, the trees, or whatever, and what language we should use about it. Should we use mother tree? Should we use communicating? Should we use looking out for the young? All of that sort of human sort of stuff. And I really don't know. But let's say a tree doesn't do any of that stuff that in the language that we're talking about. A whole bunch of me is done without my permission or knowing also. I don't tell my heart to beat faster when the rest of my body needs oxygen. It just does it. And I don't tell myself, it's time to check out the flight or fight response and see which I want to do. That just all of a sudden fills me, the flight or fight response. I don't decide that. I don't choose that. It's not willful at all. So what's the difference between a tree not knowing that it's signaling another, not knowing consciously that it's signaling another tree? How is that different from my own wonderful body? It's life. It's life. It wants to be respected and loved.
So I had a tree in my backyard, 2 of them, and I was noticing that one was dying, and my neighbors kept saying, oh, you need to cut that down. But what I noticed is that as the tree was dying, the tree next to it was getting healthier and healthier. And so I remembered this. But now one of the questions I have is, we have buckthorn, and we have to get rid of the buckthorn.
You have no obligation to love buckthorn.
Good. Praise the Lord, because, but my question is, so as I'm trying to get rid of the buckthorn, there's goats and there's poison and there's all sorts of things. And so my concern is when I am cutting the buckthorn and putting that dab of poison on the buckthorn, I'm concerned about that going to the rest of the trees.
I'm just an old retired preacher. What do I know about this stuff? But it's the right question. It's the right question.
Yeah.
And understanding and good often comes from asking the right question.
Right.
I have an answer for you.
Hey, good.
On Saturday, March 11th, on St. Olaf campus is Hort Day, and the first speaker at 9 o'clock has a session on how not to kill your trees. And she's going to talk about people who have trees who suddenly appear to be dying. And I have this many left, so if you want one of those, there you go.
So I think we'll just have time for one more, and then we'll have to wrap it up.
See, people do better in community too, not just trees.
So on the choir tour this last week, we went from Northern California into Oregon and saw where all those wildfires have been, and the dead trees, or they look dead, but they're still there. Are they getting new life somehow? Because I saw these burnt trees, I'll just put it like that, burnt trees. It was very clear. And then we went maybe a mile and a half, and there was verdant greenery, but you were left with those burnt trees. What about those?
It depends on the tree and the intensity of the fire. That's a whole new world of exploration in forest management right now, is that it appears that before we arrived here, there were no fire departments. Smokey the Bear wasn't invented yet, and so people didn't rush to put out forest fires. And so there were smaller burns that got rid of the worst that could happen. So many trees, the oldest trees especially, survived all of that because the flames didn't get to the crowns. There wasn't enough heat on the forest floor to get to the crown, so that burned. And as you probably know, the burning of organic material releases plant material, releases food, plant food, into the ground so that lots of things grow better afterwards. Volcanoes do the same thing. After Mount St. Helens erupted and covered Yakima, Washington with 2 feet of volcanic ash, suddenly the fruit tree said, wow, where's this been all my life? And grew like crazy.
I know Kurt, did you have a quick comment you wanted to make? And we are going to have to wrap it up.
Just a quick comment. Robin Kimmerer, in her book, Seeking Moss, talks about if you think you have good air, check your trees, because on the north side of the tree, there will be moss growing.
Yes, yes. Yeah, if there's enough moisture. That doesn't always happen in an arid area, but in Minnesota it certainly does. That's how I learned as a kid to know my direction out in the woods. I just looked for the moss on the north side of the tree.
Thank you so much, Bruce. This was just excellent, and I definitely feel good about loving a tree and for the wonder you have created.
Good.
And so come back next week for our 4th part in the Creation Care Team series and Seeing the Sacred in Nature. Jerry Hoekstra will be presenting Birds and the Web of Life. And so thank you again.